If we could grab our seats, last talk before the banquet address. All right, this is, as I was saying, the last talk before the banquet. So we've got a very exciting one for the last one. I've requested the party next door to try and keep it at a manageable volume. We'll see if that works out. I think Mike is the closest one to the music, so if he gets up and starts dancing, we'll understand what's going on. But I'm very happy to introduce Jake Beardsley, who's going to talk about gender identity as narrative. So Jake, take it away.
Hi, thanks so much, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? Great. So the goal of this project is to give an account of what I'm calling gender identity talk, which is the set of linguistic practices that transgender people and their allies use basically to honor transgender identity. So within gender identity talk, we're going to, for example, call somebody a man if and only if that person believes that he himself is a man, he's made that desire clear in some way, or that's our goal. We're going to say things like trans women are women. We're going to avoid gendering people in a way that contradicts their desires. And we're also going to say that non-binary genders exist. So there's just like this tangle of linguistic rules for when we're going to use words like man, woman, non-binary, gender fluid, and so on. So for this project, I have two goals. The first is to demonstrate that gender identity talk satisfies some minimal standard of coherence. When people criticize these trans inclusionary practices or this vocabulary, they often argue from a perspective or in a way which suggests that it's not only wrong, but that it's very obviously wrong and incoherent. Often it's a dismissive or mocking. So my goal here is to demonstrate not specifically that this is like the correct vocabulary or that, like, say, a biology based view of gender is definitely wrong, but rather just to show that this isn't like a house of cards or something. It's not something that you can just think about for 2 seconds and reject. And also the kinds of claims that people make in gender identity talk are internally coherent and often sophisticated. And the other goal for this project, beyond demonstrating coherence, is to show that gender identity talk has epistemic value that biology-based or sex-based accounts of gender do not have. If we were to, well, it makes it possible for people to understand and to express information about themselves, which would otherwise not be expressible, at least not within the other dominant vocabulary. This is intended primarily as a descriptive account. I'm starting with, I guess, my own confidence as a speaker of gender identity talk in the United States. And I'm working out, what are the rules and what concepts make sense of the rules. But it's entirely descriptive. I'm not claiming that this is the ultimate or the best vocabulary available. In fact, I think that probably there are things that we could change and improve about it. But I'm just, as a baseline, trying to demonstrate there's something good here. Some good practices have emerged out of like the folk discourse about gender identity, and that it deserves to be taken seriously and not hastily rejected. So the rest of this project, the rest of this presentation is divided roughly into 2 parts, where each part focuses on a different function of gender identity talk. The first function I'm calling the self-defining function, where the vocabulary of gender identity talk allows people to make claims about who they are in a deep sense, who they are at a very personal level. And the second part describes what I call the grouping function. So if I identify as, for example, a woman, I'm never just talking about myself. I'm always placing myself in a relationship to some hypothetical or actual group of people. There are some people who I would consider to be women, and I'm in some way placing myself alongside those people, saying there's some kind of relationship I have with them or some similarity I have with them, and probably also by implication some difference from men. So that's the second part of the project will be about. So just to dive into the self-defining function gender identity talk. Here I'm really building off of Talia Betcher, who gives an excellent account of the function of gender identity within transgender subcultures, Betcher argues that trans people see gender identity as an existential self-identity. In her words, this describes who I am really in a deep and fundamental sense. And my existential identity can be unpacked in terms of my values and commitments. So what is important to me and what kind of life do I commit myself to? So for example, in identifying as a particular gender, I'm making some kind of public commitment to living in a certain way. And I'm circulating that information so other people can share it. I'm telling you, you can go and tell other people that I belong to this gender also. I want to be treated in this way, I want my pronouns to be this, and so on. And I think this account is on the right track. I think it's right, but Betcher doesn't say terribly much about exactly what the nature or structure of existential self-identity is. So my project here is to elaborate on that by combining it with Hilda Lindemann's account of narrative identities. So first, what is a narrative? For Lindemann, a narrative is an interpretation of a chronicle, where chronicles are like an uninterpreted list of events that are just listed in the order that they actually happen. So of course, we're not omniscient, so we can never have a true, perfect, complete chronicle, but we can say there's some hypothetical set of events that we might appropriate for interpretation. So there's like a hypothetical set of events in all of human history, or the history of the United States, or in my life, and so on. There's the pre-interpreted material for interpretation. And I create a narrative by selecting some elements out of that chronicle and assigning importance to them, and then interpreting the important events in relation to each other. So yeah, and when I create a narrative out of a chronicle, I create a feedback loop between the particular events within the narrative and then the broader whole. So for example, let's say that I'm writing a history of the United States, and I decide to start it all the way back in ancient Athens. And I tell a story such as the ancient Athenians invented democracy and America perfected it, or something like that, which of course is a real cultural narrative. In telling that kind of story, I'm first of all changing our interpretation of the United States, the thing that I'm telling a story of, where maybe the suggestion is that America builds upon like the best parts of classical antiquity or something. And then I'm also, by including ancient Athenian democracy as an element of the story, I'm defining that element. I'm saying, well, and also this was important because of what it led to in the modern era. And likewise, if I gave like a history of first wave feminism or something, that could, the story that I tell about that could shape your interpretation of each individual element of the story, like I don't know, Susan B. Anthony and Seneca Falls Convention, and like the women's suffrage movement, and like women as an abstract category. Yeah, every element ends up being reinterpreted through the lens of the final narrative. And also in my history of the United States, hypothetically, I can draw on imagined future events as a part of telling this story. I might tell a story such as America used to be a great empire, and now we're on the decline for reasons X, Y, Z, and soon we're going to fizzle out into nothing. Or alternatively, I could tell a story like America is on the road to eradicating global poverty. And in both the situations, I'm inviting my reader to imagine some future events with me. But even though those events are imagined and have not come to pass, if you accept them, they'll still shape your interpretation of the story. So narrative identity works similarly. Lindemann thinks that personal identity just is a bundle of narratives like this, where there's a chronicle of events in my life, which are then interpreted in a way that produces a narrative, or really like multiple different narratives, maybe fragments of narratives. So maybe I have a narrative like I used to be very judgmental, and then I realized I should stop being so judgmental or something. Maybe I have a narrative about how I got interested in philosophy and why that's an important part of my life. And of course, I'm going to build up to saying that we have narratives about our genders. I think this is also a good example for the significance of the future in our narrative identities. I had a friend my freshman year of college who had always wanted to be a doctor, and he was having a crisis of identity because he was in his freshman biology class and he wasn't doing well. So on the one hand, as like a high school student, he was doing well in his classes, and I think that it kind of was maybe morally validating to see his progress as leading to becoming a doctor, this prestigious and important profession. So that made him feel like confident and maybe also like morally virtuous in some way. And then now he's having a crisis where this dread of the hypothetically failing to become a doctor is redefining him, it's redefining his self-understanding in the present in such a way that he feels like less confident, less desirable, like, yeah. Maybe another example would be like I define myself partly by the belief that I'll be like a parent in the future, and I'm worried about failing to do that in some way. Yeah, I get the idea. Right, so put a pin up for a second. So within gender identity talk, I think there are two vantage points from which we can look at gender identity, where one of them is very much fixed in the present, and the other one is more as a narrative identity that spans over a longer period of our lives. My sense gender is basically, at the present, the way that I would situate myself with respect to concepts like man and woman. So of course, for most people, that's going to be like a simple, I almost said simple identity relation, but that has a different meaning in philosophy. Like a simple like identification where I just identify as a man or a woman. And some people it's going to be kind of a identifying against those concepts, or having some complicated identification like being bigender, where you find some kind of association with both of those concepts. And it can also be a state of like pointed confusion, where maybe I feel like it's important whether I am a man or a woman or non-binary, but I haven't worked this out. And so if you ask me, and I trust that you have to be honest, I would just shrug. All of those are ways of having a sense gender. It's like what you would sincerely say about your gender, like right now. But your narrative gender, again, is like an interpretation that is meant to cover a longer portion of your life. You have memories and you have expectations and hopes and fears about the future. So your narrative gender is like the interpretation that arises and that makes the best sense of your beliefs about both the past and the future. Examples, like some trans women have had an experience as children where maybe they got into mom's makeup and they were scolded and shamed for it. That could end up being like a disturbing formative memory. Maybe you spend a lot of your adult life identifying against that memory and kind of defining yourself in opposition to the way you were meant to feel in that moment. I know female classicists who feel really personally disturbed when they read ancient misogynistic texts. And my impression, at least, is that it's often like very personal for them in a way that I would expect that it wouldn't be for male classicists, even male classicists who share the same moral sensibilities that they do. So to the extent that reading that kind of thing shapes their identities as women or shapes their sense of who they are, that would be part of their narrative gender. Yeah, and also things like expecting to be a husband or a father or a mother, or other kinds of gender roles. To the extent that like that expectation or hope shapes my sense of who I am right now, that's part of my narrative gender. And also things like expecting to transition, maybe being afraid you'll decide to transition, or like dealing with chaotic uncertainty about what your gender will be like in 10 years are all ways that your beliefs or expectations about the future can shape your sense of who you are right now. So to combine these two elements, like the Becher and the Lindemann, I'm saying that within gender identity talk, gender identity is an existential, self-defining narrative. My gender identity is an expression of who I am really in Becher's sense. It's an expression of my values and commitments and my deeply felt sense of self. And also, if I were to describe my existential identity adequately, I think it would have a narrative form. That explanation would involve drawing on things like past experiences that were salient to me in some way, and then an interpretation of those experiences, or alternatively, things that I intend to do or hope for in the future. Like, what kind of life do I think I could adequately live with in the future? Yeah, so that's it for like the first part, like the basic tools that I think are in place for why gender identity talk enables this kind of self-expression, this kind of description of oneself in detail. You could go into quite a lot of depth about like which kinds of memories about the past are part of my identity and what kind of expectations for the future. I'm going to go on to the second part, the grouping function. An important feature of gender identity talk is that it's very flexible in terms of the reasons that a person might have for identifying in a certain way. So like, 10 people might all identify as women, but then if you ask them like specifically, why do you identify as women, you might get 10 different answers. And but all those people would equally count as women given the rules that are at play. So it might seem like there's kind of a conceptual snag here, like how do we understand the way they're being grouped if we're not just going to posit a kind of similarity between them? And also this has been a problem in feminist philosophy even before most philosophers were really thinking about transgender people. It's just always been really difficult to figure out like what do women have in common. So what I'm suggesting, or at least the answer that I think is suggested by gender identity talk, is that it's not so much that we're identifying a similarity as that we are doing something when we class somebody as belonging to a certain gender. And to elaborate on the narrative metaphor, I say that gender categories are conceived of as genres. Think about what we're doing when you class a work of fiction as belonging to a genre. On the one hand, I'm identifying or making an argument about its influences. Like if I say this is a horror movie, then there are other horror movies that came before it that it's probably building off of and responding to. There are conventions that it can either play straight or subvert. So like we could say like a romantic comedy subverted the expectation that the main couple would stay together at the end, but like a horror movie doesn't have that expectation available to subvert. I'm also suggesting certain modes of evaluation for that work. So if a horror movie is not scary, we're going to criticize it. If a romantic comedy is about fundamentally unlikable people, we're not going to like it. Yeah, so we can kind of unpack this in pragmatic terms. I'm also interested in cases where there's conflict about how to categorize something in terms of genre. My decision about whether to include a certain work within a genre has implications, first of all, for our understanding of that genre in the abstract, our associations with it, and then secondly, for what people working within that genre will tend to imitate. So for example, of the first kind, think about people who insist that Die Hard is a Christmas movie, and then people who get very annoyed with members of the first group. I think the reason that people find this kind of claim so annoying is that if we were to accept that Die Hard is a Christmas movie, then it would just like radically change our perception of the genre in a way that many people consider undesirable. Obviously, our associations with Christmas movies are very much at odds with like an R-rated violent movie. Yeah, so in that case, we resist the categorization because of what it seems to say about the larger category. And also, I might resist a categorization because I don't want a particular film to hold influence within a genre. Let's say that I'm a horror fan and I'm talking to a bunch of horror fans and I didn't like Get Out. I'm annoyed that Get Out got such good reviews and that it's so popular with my friends. And I don't like the idea that Get Out is going to influence the future of horror movies. So one way that I could resist its influence is to say, well, Get Out isn't really horror. It's not scary enough to be horror. It's just a comedy. And if I succeeded at persuading people of that categorization, I would be kind of cutting off its potential to influence horror in particular. It would no longer seem like an appropriate example for horror creators to look at and copy and build off of and respond to and borrow elements from. So, and I think that in these cases, it's unlikely that there's like a totally objective answer to what really is horror, what really is a Christmas movie, under what circumstances does something count. I think that these are best diagnosed as power struggles about the identity of a genre, where that genre has like emotional and practical significance for the people who are involved in the conversation. So if genres are culturally available ways of viewing a text, then I'm saying that genders are like culturally available ways of viewing a person. Yeah, so when I categorize somebody as belonging to a certain gender, whether that person is myself or somebody else, then I'm saying something about like what is the story that led to this person being the way that they are, what cultural influences are they responding to, I think about the difference between like a very butch woman and like a man who's just kind of like an average amount of being masculine or something. Like they're responding to different norms, where one of them is being resistant to the norms that apply to her. The other one is kind of just going along with norms that apply to him. I'm possibly highlighting some elements of the person and downplaying others. I'm potentially, maybe unintentionally, bringing in certain modes for evaluation, like when do we know that this person's behavior is normal or abnormal, or more perniciously, possibly also how will we know if this person's behavior is good or bad, given the norms that apply to them. And I think likewise, as with the Get Out example, we might kind of misgender somebody as a way to cut off their potential to influence the category. So Laverne Cox is a good example of like a conventionally beautiful, very famous, talented transgender woman. And I don't think any specific celebrity has that much influence over our norms of gender, but certainly Laverne Cox is much more influenced than the average person. She's somebody that both cis and trans women will potentially look up to and imitate in certain ways. I think a good test of whether someone has this kind of influence is like, if they do something that's like non-normative for their gender, then does it reflect on them or on the activity? Like if Dwayne Johnson were to take up ballet, I don't think people's takeaway would be Dwayne Johnson is feminine. I think it would be ballet is compatible with masculinity. So Dwayne Johnson is a good example of someone who has that kind of influence over like masculinity, like what behaviors can men do, what is like desirable masculinity. So again, let's say that I don't like that Laverne Cox has this kind of like relative influence. If I say, well, she's not really a woman, then one thing that I'm potentially accomplishing, if I can persuade people of that interpretation, is that I'm saying she shouldn't have this kind of influence over I guess our culture's idea of femininity. She shouldn't be somebody that women imitate and look up to. Yeah, so from here on in the paper, I suggest a few different possible accounts that we could use to unpack this idea of gender as genre, where each possibility is a different set of concepts about gender categories, which I think, where I think in each individual account would be adequate for explaining the practices that I'm trying to explain. But here, for lack of time, I just explain one kind of account. I call this a cultural descent account, where basically manhood and womanhood are created and sustained by culture, and they are passed down between generations and also modified from generation to generation. On Theodore Bach's account, genders are like species. The different members of a species are, well, different organisms belong to the same species because of a historical relationship and also because of the way in which they were made. So let's say that 10,000 light years in that direction, there is an organism that is biologically identical to me. That organism would not be a human because it wasn't created through the process by which all of us here are related to each other. Humans are a historical kind, and in Bach's view, so are genders. A person is a woman if she was created, if she was socially influenced and shaped by the processes that we use to socialize women and so on. I modify his metaphor a bit by changing it from species to biological populations. Because populations, of course, can, populations of the same species can interbreed, and so you can have organisms that are partly descended from different ones. I might be 75% descended from population A and 25% from population B. And in the same way, I think I could be 75% influenced by, say, the male cultural lineage and 25% influenced by the female cultural lineage. But that doesn't undercut the idea that something like this lineage exists. Like we can, with a lot of like effort and looking through historical records and so on, track the evolution of cultural ideas associated with masculinity and see that there is some kind of something there that we can, I think, reasonably describe as a lineage. And I also think that this concept of the gender lineage is helpful for making the leap from the self-defining to the grouping function. So let's say that I am a transgender man and I have a good understanding of my narrative gender. I could tell you what my existential self-defining narrative regarding gender is. I can say a lot about like myself. And now I want to explain to you what it is that I mean when I say that I'm a man, that I belong to like some group of people that I'm conceiving of as men. I think that one way to unpack this kind of claim would be to say that, well, imagine that like, this lineage exists and we can refer to it, maybe it has rough borders, but more or less we know what we're talking about. I think he can just kind of point to that lineage and say like, that's me, that's what I'm participating in. These are the cultural influences and this is the history that has shaped me and made me into the person that I am. And also it's the one that I want to participate in. It's the one that I want to be able to help like modify and reproduce as an insider, as somebody who can be seen as an example of this kind. And we can modify this for other kinds of identities. Like an agender person might refer to both lineages and express that like neither of them is really a good description of that person's influences or what they want to participate in. And also, non-binary people can and do sometimes create new lineages. So let's say that I come up with a novel gender identity that has not previously been described. And I think about this very hard and I describe my experience very well and I explain what I mean by this term. And other people understand the label well enough that some of them actually take it up and adopt it as an identity. So in that way, there actually would be a mechanism by which this lineage can be replicated, and potentially it could go on for generations. There could be like a long history of people being partly shaped by the lineage that I created with this new concept. Yeah, I guess I will conclude there. Thanks so much.
All right, next up we have comments from Melina Bell. We're going to have to unmute her, and I will make sure that she is up there. Take it away, Melina.
Is my sound okay? Can you hear me?
Sound is good.
Okay, great. Thank you for that really interesting and helpful paper, Jake. Here are my comments. As I understand it, Jake's project theorizes the concept of gender identity, which they view as an important means for trans people to both understand their own identities and explain their experiences to others, as well as to, quote, make sense of practices surrounding, unquote, gender identity. Jake suggests that we should understand gender identity as the mental narrative that each person has about their own gender identity. This mental narrative has two components, sense gender and narrative gender. Jake explains gender identity as narrative, framing their inquiry as one about linguistic practices. How do we use the term gender identity? First, Jake addresses the norm relevance account of gender identity, which is both over and under inclusive in its attempts accurately to identify binary trans people as men or women. Jake proposes an alternative narrative account. This begins with a definition of sense gender, namely, quote, S has a sense gender at time t if the historical concepts of man or woman are integral to their sense of self at that time, unquote. The concepts can be integral not only if the person claims one as an identity, but also if the person finds it important to reject either or both, or regards it as important to their identity that they're uncertain how to classify themselves. Next, Jake defines narrative gender. Rather than being indexed to time t, narrative gender, quote, describes the influence which sense gender has on a person's perception of their history or future. This can include the way past events shape present self-perceptions of gender identity or judgments about whether past versions of one's self-identity foreshadowed or conflicted with current sense gender. It can also include how one imagines oneself as a gendered being in the future, as an old woman or old man, for example, or how one regards their gender identity as unstable or flexible and open to change. Sense gender can matter to how a person interprets history relative to her own life, such as feeling connected to the women's suffrage movement because she identifies as a woman. Sense gender and narrative gender are concepts that both seem useful for understanding aspects of a person's identity, history, life and imagined future, and how they all relate to one another. For example, they might help Caitlyn Jenner explain, if she wanted to, that her sense gender when she appeared on my Wheaties box after winning a gold medal in the men's decathlon at the 1976 Olympics was in tension with her current sense gender, or at least that it's now in tension with her current sense gender. Jake endeavors to provide a non-circular account of gender identity that anchors the concept in a cultural discourse. I find it intuitive that each person has first-person authority over their gender identity, the way each person has first-person authority over whether they're in pain. No other person can know whether I'm in pain better than I can, so I'm the final authority on the truth of Melina is in pain. Likewise, I'm the final authority on the truth of the statement, Melina identifies as a woman. So why not just say a woman is any person who identifies as a woman? This attractive solution both recognizes first-person authority and never attributes the wrong gender to people. But it's circular because the definition of a woman necessarily uses the term woman, so that term or concept is not anchored in anything outside the circular definition. Jake proposes anchoring gender identities in historical lineages, meaning that, quote, expressions of gender identity are claims to membership within some group, unquote. The basic idea is that women across history, from Cleopatra to me, share something that contrasts with what Plato and Joe Biden share. Jake adapts this notion from Theodore Bach, who characterizes gender as a social kind, meaning that, quote, to be a woman is to be a product of the historical process which creates women, unquote. On the interpretation Jake uses, we can understand this type of historical process in terms of what they refer to as its upstream and downstream features. Upstream are the conditions under which we would accept a claim such as Joe Biden is a man, while downstream, we find the consequences of accepting this. One being that there's never been a woman president of the United States. In communities that respect trans people's self-identities, a trans man will be classified as a man because he self-identifies as a man. In communities hostile to trans people, only people with a particular type of reproductive physiology will be classified as men. So in Jake's approach, to say I'm a woman means I understand myself as belonging to the lineage of women, or I understand myself as being importantly related to women in other times and places. This avoids circularity. It also provides an alternative to attempting to list necessary and sufficient conditions for what counts as a man, woman, or other gender identity, and undertaking many have failed at, and a project very unlikely to succeed. Jake also specifies that although man and woman are the most common gender lineages, there are others, such as gender fluid, hijra, and two-spirit. Then each person could either point to one of these patterns to claim a shared lineage with the relevant kind, or could claim a gender identity that rejects them all and possibly establishes the beginning of a new lineage. So lineages and their constituent gender identities can come in and out of existence over time. So gender identity for both Jake and me involves a first-person identification with or dissociation from particular gender classifications, which classifications I'll simply refer to as gender. The conceptual framework for understanding gender that I have found most helpful is that of American psychiatrist Sandra Lipsitz-Bem, explained in her 1994 book, The Lenses of Gender, Transforming the Debate on Sexual Inequality. Bem provides an account of lenses of gender that are culturally transmitted through the usual socialization processes that people experience from birth, and through the subliminal messages that people read from their culture throughout their lives. These lenses are reproduced from generation to generation without cultural natives even noticing. Cultural natives are those who internalize the lenses, to some extent, all of us. Accepting this framework for the most part, I view gender as a destructive force in my society and in the world. Gender limits the freedom of women to serve in leadership positions, such as in government and high levels of business, the freedom of boys to take drama classes instead of play football. It places obstacles in the way of loving and having a family with a partner of the same sex, and pressures intersex and trans people, binary and non-binary, to feel that they need to correct themselves to fit into one of the social groups, struggle against the current. Gender disadvantages women, anyone filling a traditionally feminine role, and anyone who's not a man, resulting in wage gaps, underrepresentation, harassment, and violence. I wish I could just zap gender out of existence. Yet I understand how certain forms of resistance, what Bem calls oppositional consciousness, can depend on having a gender identity. For example, to fight against women's oppression and for women's equality, some people have to identify as women and join in solidarity. To fight for their rights, other oppressed people need to coalesce around identities such as lesbian, gay, transgender, and so forth. We need these identities so long as there's oppression against people who identify as members of these groups. For me, that is the grouping function that Jake recognizes as necessary. People must group to resist certain forms of oppression that they face because they're identified externally by others as members of a subordinate group. So I see gender as externally imposed and gender identity as a way of reclaiming one's identity and resisting oppression aimed at it. For me, gender is a, hopefully, temporary necessary evil. We all have multiple overlapping identities. Mine include being a woman, professor, philosopher, spouse, strength athlete, and Greek American. Some of these are more central to who I am than others. I consider myself importantly related to my family and to other professors, but not to the lineage of women. I was enculturated to identify as a woman. The cultural brainwashing worked, and with little to no reflection, I became a cisgender woman. But I didn't choose that identity, and I don't want to count myself as part of a lineage of historically, and to various extents still, subordinated, oppressed, underdeveloped beings. I embrace some feminine coded qualities, such as being cooperative, nurturing, and connected, but it's an accident of history that these dispositions are coded feminine and not masculine, or worse, as Claudia Card says, these are virtues of subordinated people who develop them as survival strategies. In a revised version of the paper that Jake shared with me, they shift from understanding the grouping function as a lineage to understanding it as a genre. We would understand existing women as being the same gender as Joan of Arc, for example. Genres provide a context for narrative genders, such as by providing standards for evaluation and establishing a relevant sphere of influence. For example, it wouldn't be appropriate to say of a spy movie spoof that some stunts were over the top and not believable, though it would be appropriate to say that of a spy movie. Quote, calling a person a woman, Jake says, invites certain ways of evaluating her experiences, her behavior and dispositions, and perhaps also her appearance. Jake adds that women should influence our understanding of and expectations for women generally. Jake's objective here is to show that a conceptual account of a grouping function is possible, though they recognize that different accounts might work better within different communities of speakers. In this version of gender identity as narrative, Jake focuses on the power that someone who belongs to a genre can exercise in influencing how that genre develops. So a trans woman in a context where she can be recognized as part of the genre woman can influence how that genre develops. For example, she can contribute to the development of a meaning of woman, which does not necessarily include being born with a particular anatomy, simply by existing as a woman with different circumstances and modeling womanhood under those circumstances. I like the genre approach better than the lineage approach because it's more explicit about how the concept of woman can evolve, and it clearly acknowledges that different communities of speakers can have different concepts of woman. Like Jake, I find Talia Betcher's work illuminating for understanding gender in a trans context in particular. Betcher proposes that we embrace, quote, multiple worlds of sense, communities within which, for example, the concept woman isn't attached to a particular kind of anatomy. We can create a world of sense within a particular community where discovering that a woman has a penis, for example, does not seem like any sort of contradiction, since some woman in that world of sense will have penises. Woman will be tied to other attributes than what we assume other people's genitals are. These meanings can be resistant, opposed to dominant meanings, and open to future development. Betcher's account shares some features with Jake's genre account. Different communities can have different senses of woman, and women, as understood in that community, can collectively influence how their genre definition evolves. Of course, Betcher's multiple worlds of sense don't give us one objective, universal, fixed concept of woman that includes anyone who's a woman in any time and place and excludes anyone who's not. But do we need that? What do we need it for? We don't need it for self-identity. We don't need it for political resistance. Perhaps we need it for philosophical or linguistic neatness, but that doesn't feel urgent to me. If I had to subsume a gender classification like woman within a descriptive philosophical category, I'd say it's a family resemblance concept in Wittgenstein's sense. Women have overlapping shared features. They characteristically can and do give birth. They're expected to, and most do, spend a significant portion of their time during some periods of their lives providing physical care to others, children, elderly parents, spouses. All are statistically more likely to face sexual and other violence, including from romantic partners, than non-women. These have been true throughout different times and places of women of all races, body types, and sexual orientations. Or if these are disputable, certainly some overlapping shared features can be found. Admittedly, these aren't true of every woman or false of every non-woman. And the same can be done for men. The gender that fights wars, governs nations, makes the policy decisions for society. The grouping functions of gender seem to be clustered in families of traits, not in lineages. In summary, I agree with Jake's mental narrative account. Although I initially rejected their account of lineage or genre as a grouping function, that was mainly because I was thinking in terms of reforming gender concepts instead of describing the existing ones. I appreciate Jake's attempt to tackle the difficult task of theorizing gender identity concepts and claims in a non-circular, trans-inclusive, accurate way. Thank you.
Great. Melina, thank you so much. Jake, I want to invite you to come back up here. As usual, if you have anything you'd like to say in response, feel free to, and I'll start taking questions. Just raise your hand and I'll add you to the list, and people in the Zoom can start raising their hands or putting the questions in the chat. So.
Thank you so much, Melina. I will try to briefly respond to one of your more important points, but then I'll try to spend most of the time answering questions from the group. I'm glad that you brought up. I think some of your comments shine light on a long-standing tension within discussion, I think, among feminists and let's say queer or transgender people, or people like writing about these topics from a queer perspective, where so you describe a situation where like oppositional consciousness depends on gender identity, and so women will embrace that identity out of like a need to survive or a need to politically organize. And I think that a lot of trans people perceive that it happens in the opposite direction for them. Like I just have like an existential need to identify and to live in a certain way, and I politically organize to make that possible. And I think that the practices that I'm describing are built by people who kind of often have a mistaken assumption that that characteristic is shared by all or most cisgender people. So I think that a really common assumption, at least in the kinds of like trans inclusionary communities that I have a lot of experience in, is that like cisgender women basically are pretty similar to transgender women in terms of like how much they experience their womanhood as like a very positive aspect of them. Obviously not all cis women, not all trans women, but Yeah, so I think that basically your criticisms of the way that maybe this account papers over like the oppression of women or the ways that gender identity can be a tool for this oppression is a problem with our actual practices surrounding transgender identity or gender identity in transgender subcultures, and that it's just like an issue that has to be worked out in real life. So I hope that if future versions of this paper succeed in still giving a good descriptive account of the practices, that it will actually like open it up to the kinds of criticisms that you're raising. Where it's like on the one hand, a lot of people are embracing like manhood and womanhood as like truly positive aspects of themselves that they think are actually like kind of necessary or part of the end of political organizing about gender. Like I want to be able to live as a man or a woman unproblematically and free from harm. Sorry, I guess I'll pause there, but I hope that was clear enough for now. Thank you so much. And I'll start taking questions from the crowd.
Thank you, Jake. This was a lot of really interesting stuff. So mine is just a very trying to get clear exactly about the project. And so starting with this first sentence, so the aim of this paper is to explain gender identity talk or the set of linguistic practices which speakers use to explain and to honor transgender identity. I don't know if you meant that or as like what comes at that second disjunct, whether you mean that to be, that's what I mean by gender identity talk.
Sorry, I mean like which I define as.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah.
So that's interesting because I would think if somebody who wanted to explain gender identity talk would want to explain, and even when a cisgender person says identify as a man, or even if whereas the set of linguistic practices which speakers use to explain and to honor transgender identity, I mean that's very broad. I mean, what might explain that? People have motivations to be compassionate, and that might explain. So I kind of worry that about which one I have a sense of what you would mean by gender identity talk that I kind of follow throughout the paper. But then the specific things, set of linguistic practices speakers use to explain to honor transgender identity, it seems very specific, and the explanation for that might not be what the same thing that would explain what I would normally think of as gender identity talk. So that's my comment / question.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is more clear in the paper. I did struggle with how to phrase that. My thinking is that like before, basically there was like a previous time where the default in almost all communities, or at least almost all communities in let's say the United States, would have a gender vocabulary that tracks anatomical features. And so I'm thinking that historically these practices were created for the purpose of accommodating transgender people while also generalizing to cisgender people. So that's what I was trying to get across with that. And the idea is that it's rules surrounding terms that have something to do with gender. So that definitely includes like man, woman, non-binary. I think it includes like masculine, feminine. And I had on whether it includes like gay or something. So I don't give a full account of like what are the limits of gender talk, but I just pull out this one strand of it. What are our application conditions for terms that describe a person's gender?
Can I ask one follow-up?
Yeah.
Just really, do you take gender talk to be different from gender identity talk? Because I take gender identity talk to be more like identify as, or but gender talk just be like man, woman, or whatever. So is it specifically gender identity talk or gender?
Yeah, so this is one thing I cut out from the presentation because I thought it might be less helpful than other things. But gender talk is just in any community, anywhere, the practices surrounding gender or linguistic practices surrounding gender. So every community, as far as I'm aware, has some gender categories that they talk about. There are certain rules and some conditions under which you'll say someone belongs to a certain gender. And then we can kind of like abstract out certain communities with broadly overlapping practices. So like there are cis-centric communities where like the practices that are mostly at play are tracking anatomy. And then gender identity talk describes communities where people are primarily tracking someone's self-described identity.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, our next question is going to be from Bryce Huebner on Zoom.
Hey, Jake, I really enjoyed the talk, and one of the things that I found myself wondering about is something that you touched on in your last couple of sentences, And it's the way to think about things like xenogenders. And I'm wondering how you think about those kinds of cases where people are trying to push hard at the boundaries of gender identity talk and trying to think about how to find identities that sit beyond the boundaries of what's culturally available. And I wonder if you have thoughts about how to situate that within your sort of normatively structured account of gender identity talk.
Yeah, so one view that I have, which I think my impression is that it's not super controversial among people who do philosophy of gender, although I could be wrong about that, but it might be more controversial among like ordinary speakers in like heavily queer or trans spaces, is that I think that an account of gender really does in some way need to center man and woman, by which I mean there's like, I use language like a node. It's like my identity has sort of nodes in it, where like one of them is like gender, one of them is like religion, one of them is like race. And so if somebody asks me like, what gender are you? I can say like I'm a man or I'm a woman or I'm non-binary, but I can't say like I'm Catholic. So I kind of take men and women to be like the central examples to which other examples have the ability to displace them. So I'm not sure if I'm quite answering what you're hoping I'll answer, but I see this kind of process of like creating new vocabulary, and then also, well, gender identity talk already has certain rules in place for like how to introduce a new gender and what you should do when you encounter somebody who identifies with a gender that you hadn't heard of before. So in that way, it enables the creation of new gender categories and lineages, which are capable of taking the place of like man or woman as an entity. Is that on track for what you're looking for? Or do you have other questions about it?
Yeah, it's definitely on track. I'm just thinking about communities of folks who start trying to build identities that lie, as it's often put, beyond the boundaries of human. And it's definitely playing the same kind of role as the kinds of contents that you're thinking about, but they're framed as ways of disrupting the standard ways of theorizing gender spaces.
Oh, okay. I think I understand now. Yeah, this might be, and I don't know if I was clear enough about this when I was trying to respond to Melina. I think it might be kind of similar in that there might just be a criticism of gender identity talk within this kind of worry. Like if your goal really is to destabilize the gender binary or to destabilize our current beliefs about like men and women or something, then you might just have to change our linguistic practices. And so that's just not something, I have like maybe some free floating thoughts about that, but nothing that is like really polished that I'm prepared to just speak about in this context, I guess. But I guess my answer just in terms of this paper is that I think something that's really disruptive would go beyond or in some way be opposed to parts of what I'm describing. Thank you.
All right, we're going to go to Katie.
Hi, Jake. Thank you for this paper. I think your definition of gender identity is very coherent. One thing that I was wondering about was, do you think your conception of gender could and should be extended to other social classes such as race?
Oh, I thought about that a little bit. I don't have like a polished opinion about it. Probably not, because again, I'm describing a certain set of linguistic practices, and I don't think that there is an equivalent for race. I don't know whether there are communities where like transracial identity is like broadly recognized or what they're doing, or if that description would work for them or not. I'm guessing there are some elements that you could borrow from this. Like maybe you could describe someone's racial identity. I'm sure that you could say there are like racial narratives where like you have certain formative experiences. Like I read multiple accounts where like maybe a Black person at a young age, or maybe a mixed race person, realized for the first time that they weren't white, and it could have been like a very disturbing or traumatic experience. So I think you could definitely like borrow that narrative facet of it. I guess the more I think about it, you probably could do that. You could also view like whiteness or blackness or other races as like kind of genres that people can like pull ideas out of and use to like contextualize a person. So I guess the answer is yes, but I haven't thought about this enough to say it very confidently. But thank you. Yeah.
Hello. So I wanted to ask about narrative gender. I guess, is it supposed to be that gender kind of is defined in its relationship to one's life experience. And if so, I guess I was just thinking about, like you gave an example of a trans woman might remember memories of trying on dresses as a child. And I've heard stories like that, although I've also heard some trans people say that, like trans women say, they actually feel as though they were a man up until a certain point, and then they became a woman. And that's not the case, that they just always were a trans woman. And I guess with cases like that, I'm not sure what to make of that and on the narrative gender view, if that means that their gender identity is still influenced by the time they spent as a man. And then how we're supposed to weigh kind of the past against the future, or if it's, are they still a woman because they're going to spend more time as a woman in the future? But then there would be a question of, what if someone realizes that they're trans at an old age? Then does the length of the past experience outweigh their future experience? And if we're just going to kind of put aside the past experience and say, no, it's more about how they identify now, then at that point, it seems like we're just shifting over to sense gender as gender identity.
Yeah, so this is one thing I really should get better at, like being clear about up front, 'cause I have to clarify it a lot. But it's not as though your narrative gender entails a certain identity, or like there's like a formula for how we like weigh different features of it. It's more that like my narrative gender is unique to me. Each person has the unique like narrative surrounding their gender. And so whatever significance any person ascribes, I guess on a good interpretation of their psychology, so it's not just completely a matter of your preference. But in fact, like with the way that you, sorry, I'm gonna take a step back and maybe take comparison. So first, like think about trans women who did identify as a man for a very long amount of time, and then they say, oh, I was actually always a woman. I would see that as like a reinterpretation of the past event, and philosophers are sometimes worried about this, like, oh, well, how can we say that your identity determines your gender and then not like retroactively misgender these women or something? And I would say it's still, the genre idea still works. It's like I'm taking these events from my past and I'm putting them under a certain light, and I'm changing their significance in terms of how they define me right now. Like the fact that I lived as a man until I was 35 doesn't necessarily say something about me right now. But the account has to be very flexible in terms of what significance people can ascribe to the same event. So like, let's say the one trans woman transitions when she's 35, and now she believes she was always a woman, and another person says, I was a man until I was 35, then I started transitioning and I gradually became a woman or something. Those would just still both be things that the person can, those would still be explicable and reasonable narrative genders to have. They could still explain their identities in a very sophisticated way by explaining these events that I'm describing as fitting into the narrative gender. And also as for the question of like, how do we weigh like the past versus the future, that could also depend on the person. Like maybe one person, I don't think this is very likely, but maybe one person like literally just doesn't care about their past. They just don't see it as defining them at all. And they're only interested in like the future and what do I intend to do for the rest of my life. In that case, what's really important about that person would just be their ideas about the future and so on. So yeah, I hope that, does that answer your questions yet, or great?
We have 2 minutes if there's any final questions. It looks like we have a question in the chat. So.
Okay, Lisa Gibson is asking that I talk about gender.
Hi, Jake. So my question was, for people who sometimes present as in the traditional binary way as female, and then choose to present as male and sort of go back and forth between those two, could you just talk about sort of that gender fluid expression and how that fits into your larger thesis?
So one thing I want to be careful about, that I actually haven't been very careful about throughout the past hour, is that I can't like analytically say like people with this identity would have this kind of experience and this relationship to these concepts. Just to go through the different parts of the project, I would say first, that person's sense gender can be cashed out in terms of like, at any time, my relationship to man and woman is that I sometimes identify with the one and not the other, or having a complicated relationship with both of them, or whatever it is that would be accurate for them. And the narrative gender could also involve this like cyclical moving between, or like, this maybe sporadic moving between different ways of identifying with these concepts. So for any particular gender fluid person, it's going to involve like maybe like an extended present where it's not just like what do I do like right now and then the past and the future are discrete from each other. Maybe it's going to involve like habitually I tend to like change in these ways over a period of time. And then I can just like give a sophisticated explanation of like what are these elements, how do I relate to them, and how does that give rise to my identifying as gender fluid. Yeah, so as with the previous example, I think the answer is just that like people can have unique narrative genders, and then you can describe those in a highly personal way, even if it doesn't describe everyone who has the same identity label that you have. And as for the lineages, again, like a gender fluid person probably is being affected by both the masculine and feminine lineages, and the exact way they are affected by them is going to be unique to them personally. I have that set there.
All right, that brings us to full time. Let's thank our speakers. Thank you all for great questions. 15 minutes to let the people bring in the banquet food.